She grabbed his sleeve with both hands, her knuckles white, her voice breaking, and she cried out right there on the platform in front of everyone, "You got the wrong bride." The cowboy didn't flinch. He didn't step back. He just looked at her, this trembling stranger with a worn suitcase and tear-streaked cheeks, and the corner of his mouth lifted into something slow and quiet and absolutely certain. And then he said something that no one on that platform would ever forget. "Matke." Before we go any further, if stories like this move you, please subscribe to this channel and follow along until the very end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. The train was 40 minutes late. Ethan Callahan had been standing at the edge of the Harlow Creek platform for nearly an hour, and he hadn't moved once. Not when the wind picked up and cut straight through his coat. Not when old Gerald Pruitt walked past and offered him a flask. Not when the station master cleared his throat for the third time and said probably too loudly, "Could be another delay, Mr. Callahan? Could be the storm out of Billings?" Ethan just nodded once and kept his eyes on the tracks. He wasn't the kind of man who talked when silence would do. He was 36 years old, built the way Montana builds a man, wide across the shoulders, weathered at the edges with hands that had pulled fence posts from frozen ground and held dying calves through February nights. He wasn't a man who looked for shortcuts. He wasn't a man who complained. And he wasn't a man who had ever asked for much from the world. But he had asked for this. He had written 6 letters over 5 months. Careful letters, honest letters, letters that didn't try to make his life sound better than it was. "I run a cattle ranch outside of Harlow Creek, Montana. It's a hard life. The winters are long. I don't have a great deal to offer in the way of comfort or luxury. But I work hard, I don't drink to excess, and I keep my word. I'm looking for a partner, someone who isn't afraid of real life." He'd been embarrassed sending them. A grown man writing letters to a woman he'd never met through one of those correspondence agencies his neighbor Ruth had pushed on him after his 3rd consecutive Christmas alone. It felt undignified. It felt desperate. But Clara Whitmore had written back, and her letters had been something. She wrote with confidence. She wrote about wanting adventure, wanting open land and clean air, and a man who didn't spend his evenings at a saloon. She sent a photograph. She was beautiful in the way that photographs sometimes lie about sharp features, good posture, a direct gaze that made Ethan feel for the first time in a long while like the idea of someone sharing his table wasn't completely ridiculous. He wasn't in love with her. He knew that. You couldn't be in love with a photograph and 6 letters. But he had been hopeful. And Ethan Callahan did not allow himself to be hopeful very often. So he stood on that platform in the January cold, turning his hat in his hands, and he waited. The train came in with a shriek of metal and a great exhale of steam, and the platform filled immediately with the noise of arrival porters calling out luggage dragging across boards. Children who had been sitting still for 8 hours suddenly unleashed into the cold air. Ethan straightened, scanned the doors as they opened. He had memorized the photograph. Dark hair pinned up, a red scarf she'd mentioned she'd be wearing. He looked for both. People came off the train in a rush, a family with 3 young boys, a pair of businessmen in wool suits, an elderly preacher with a satchel, and then the crowd thinned and still he didn't see her. He moved closer to the steps of the second car. And then a woman appeared in the doorway. She was not Clara Whitmore. He knew it instantly, the way you know something in your chest before your mind has even caught up. This woman was younger, maybe late 20s. Her hair was brown, not dark, and it had come loose at the sides like she'd been worrying at it with her fingers for most of the journey. She wore a gray wool coat that was too light for Montana winter. She carried a single suitcase that looked like it had been repacked in a hurry, the clasp not quite closed. Her eyes found him because he was the only one standing there alone, hat in hand looking straight at her, and they went wide with something that wasn't surprise. It was dread. She knew exactly who he was. She came down the steps slowly, like each one cost her something, and she stopped in front of him at a distance that felt deliberately maintained close enough to speak far enough to run. Mr. Callahan, she said. Her voice was steady. It cost her to make it that way. That's right, he said. She swallowed. Her hands tightened on the handle of the suitcase. My name is Margaret Ellis. She paused. I'm not the woman you were expecting. I know that. I know what you must be thinking right now. And I want you to know that I'm not trying to deceive you. There's no easy way to say this, so I'm going to say it plainly. Ethan waited. Clara Whitmore isn't coming. Margaret's voice dropped slightly. She decided the night before we were supposed to leave that she couldn't do it. She said she'd met someone else, someone in the city, and she said she was sorry but she wasn't going to Montana. She exhaled and her breath fogged the cold air. I was her companion on the journey. I had my own reasons for needing to leave the city. And Clara, she thought she said it might work out. She thought maybe you wouldn't mind. That maybe someone was better than no one. She stopped. I know how that sounds. I'm sorry. You got the wrong bride, Mr. Callahan. I'm sorry. The last word came out cracked, and she pressed her lips together hard. The platform had quieted around them. Gerald Pruitt was pretending not to listen from 20 feet away. The station master had gone very still near his window. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Not the way men looked at Margaret Ellis, which was usually briefly, and then away assessing her as the lesser version of whatever they'd been hoping for. He looked at her the way he looked at the land when a storm was coming, carefully trying to understand what was actually there. She was frightened. She was ashamed of being frightened. She was holding herself together through sheer willpower, and she was doing a better job of it than most people would have. He said quietly, "You came a long way to tell me that." She blinked. That wasn't the response she'd prepared for. "I didn't think it was right to just disappear," she said. "Or send a telegram. You deserve to hear it in person. That was decent of you." He looked at her suitcase. "Is that everything you brought?" "Yes." "Where are you planning to go?" She hesitated. Just a fraction of a second. But he caught it. "I'll figure that out," she said. "There must be a boarding house in town. I have a little money. I'll be fine." He looked at her coat, too thin, entirely wrong for the temperature. He looked at the sky, which had been turning the color of old pewter since noon. He said, "It's going to drop to 15 below tonight. I'll manage." "Margaret." He said her name plainly, not unkindly, the way you'd say the name of someone who was about to do something genuinely foolish. "The only boarding house in Harlow Creek is run by a woman named Edna Ferris, and she doesn't open her doors after 5 o'clock in January because she says the cold gets in and ruins her baking. It's 4:30. You won't make it in time on foot, and there's no one to drive you." Margaret stared at him. "Are you telling me there is nowhere for me to go tonight?" "I'm telling you," he said, and he settled his hat back on his head, "that maybe the wrong bride is exactly the right one." She almost argued with him. He could see it, the refusal rising up in her, the instinct to say, "No, I'll find a way. I don't want your charity. I don't want to owe you anything." But the wind chose that moment to come off the mountains with a particular ferocity, and Margaret Ellis shuddered in her thin coat, and whatever argument she'd been forming died on her lips. "Just for tonight," she said tightly. "Just for tonight." He agreed. He picked up her suitcase before she could reach for it and started toward the wagon. She stood there for a moment watching him walk away, this quiet, weathered man who had just been told in front of half the town that the woman he'd spent 5 months corresponding with had sent a stranger in her place, and he hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't looked humiliated. He hadn't made her feel like something dirty that had arrived on his doorstep. He'd just offered her a ride. She didn't understand him. She was fairly certain she should be afraid of him. She was also fairly certain, as she hurried to catch up with him, that she had never in her life been less afraid of a man. The ride to the ranch took 40 minutes. For the first 20, neither of them spoke. Margaret sat on the bench seat of the wagon and watched the land open up around her, and tried to process the fact that she was riding through the Montana wilderness with a complete stranger whose intended bride she was decidedly not on her way to a ranch she had never seen with a suitcase that contained. She tried not to think about this almost everything she owned in the world. She was not a woman who made impulsive decisions. She was not a woman who took risks. She was historically a woman who did the sensible thing, the safe thing, the thing that kept her small and out of trouble and unlikely to disappoint anyone. And look where that had gotten her. After 20 minutes, Ethan spoke. "Were you her friend Clara's?" Margaret considered how to answer that honestly. "I was her companion. Her family employed mine when we were younger. We grew up in the same house more or less, though not as equals." She paused. "She was kind to me mostly, in the way that people are kind when it costs them nothing." He nodded slowly, absorbing that. "And your reasons for leaving," he said, "the ones you mentioned. You don't have to tell me, but I'd rather know what I'm dealing with." Margaret looked at the side of his face. "You'd rather know if I'm running from something dangerous." "I'd rather know what to expect," he said. "That's all. I'm not a complicated man, Margaret. I don't like surprises." She almost smiled at that. "You seem remarkably calm for someone who just received a very large surprise." "I'm calm on the outside," he said. "I've had practice." She looked at her hands in her lap. Thought about how much to say. "There was a man," she said finally, "in Boston. A business associate of the family I worked for after my own family's circumstances changed. He decided I would be useful to him. Not in the way you might think," she added quickly. "He wanted me to marry his son. His son was troubled. The family wanted someone quiet, someone who wouldn't make demands, someone who could be managed." She paused. "I was told I should be grateful for the opportunity." Ethan's jaw shifted. "And were you—" "No." The word came out harder than she intended. "I was not grateful. I was furious. But I had nowhere to go. No money of my own. No family left who could help. And then Clara told me she'd decided not to take the train to Montana, and she laughed about it. She genuinely laughed like it was a story she'd tell at parties, and she said, 'Maybe you should go instead, Maggie. It might be your only chance.'" She stopped. Ethan said nothing. "I know she meant it cruelly," Margaret said. "She didn't mean to be kind, but she was right. It was my only chance." She looked up at him. "And so here I am, on a wagon in Montana, with a man who was expecting someone entirely different. And I have no idea what I'm doing." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Neither do I most of the time. The difference is, I've stopped expecting to." The ranch appeared at the end of a long, straight drive lined with fence posts, and Margaret's first thought was that it was smaller than she'd imagined. Her second thought was that it looked like a place that had been loved and then let go. The main house solid and well-built, but weathered. The paint faded at the edges. The porch bearing 2 chairs that had clearly been there through too many winters. There was a barn off to the left that was in better shape than the house, which told her something about Ethan Callahan's priorities. A bunkhouse further back. A chicken coop. A garden bed that had been put to sleep for the winter under a layer of straw. It was nothing like where she'd come from. It was also, she realized with a strange jolt, the first place she'd ever arrived at where no one was waiting to judge her. A man came out of the barn as the wagon pulled up, younger than Ethan, lean and quick-moving, with a startled expression when he saw Margaret beside his employer. "This is Pete Hadley," Ethan said, climbing down and tying off the horses. "He runs the day-to-day when I'm away. Pete, this is Miss Margaret Ellis. She'll be staying with us." Pete's eyes went to Margaret, then back to Ethan, and the question forming on his face was completely transparent. Ethan said simply, "It's a long story." "Right," said Pete. He looked at Margaret again. "Ma'am?" He touched his hat brim. "Mr. Hadley," she said. Ethan carried her suitcase up the porch steps and held the door open for her. She stepped inside. The house smelled like wood smoke and coffee, and something faintly of horses, the way working men's houses did. It was clean, or rather it was the kind of clean that men managed when they were tidy by nature, not by habit. Everything had a place, but the places weren't always the right places. The kitchen table had a lamp on it that belonged on a shelf. There was a single coffee mug on the windowsill that had been set down 2 days ago and forgotten. She stood in the middle of the front room and looked around. Ethan set her suitcase by the stairs. "There's a room upstairs," he said. "It was meant to be. It was prepared for a guest. You can use it." He said the words without awkwardness, and she appreciated that. "There's a fire going in the kitchen. Are you hungry?" She was starving. She hadn't eaten since the morning. "I don't want to impose," she said. He looked at her with an expression that was patient and just slightly exasperated. "I'm going to make supper regardless, Margaret. I'm asking if you want some." "Yes," she said. "Please. Thank you." He nodded and went to the kitchen. She stood in the front room alone for a moment. She had expected anger. She had prepared for it. The entire journey had rehearsed her apologies, mapped out her arguments, steeled herself for the cold or contemptuous version of get back on the train. She had been so prepared for rejection that she didn't know quite what to do with the absence of it. She picked up her suitcase and went upstairs. The room was simple. A bed with a quilt, a washstand, a window that looked out toward the barn, a small mirror on the wall that showed her a woman who looked considerably worse than she had that morning, her hair half undone, her eyes too bright a redness at the end of her nose from the cold. She sat down on the edge of the bed, and then very quietly she allowed herself to shake, just for a moment, just while no one was watching. She pressed her hands flat on her thighs and breathed through it, the fear that had been chasing her from Boston, the desperate lunging decision to get on that train. The horror of that platform moment, when she'd had to look Ethan Callahan in the eye and say, "You got the wrong bride," all of it running through her at once like cold water. She had made it this far. She didn't know what came next, but she had made it this far. She got up, fixed her hair as best she could, washed her face with water from the washstand, and went back downstairs. He was making soup, something with beans and salt pork from the smell of it. Simple food, the kind of food you made when you were tired, and it was cold, and you needed something that would actually stick. She stopped in the doorway. "Can I help?" He glanced over his shoulder. "There's bread in the box on the counter, if you want to cut some." She found the bread, found a knife, cut it the way her mother had taught her evenly, neither too thick nor too thin. The kind of thing you didn't think about until you were doing it. They worked in silence for a few minutes. Not uncomfortable silence, just quiet. The kind of quiet that comes between people who have already said the hard things and don't need to fill the space with noise. Finally, Margaret said, "The people in town. They saw me get off the train with you." "They did," he said. "They'll talk." "They will," he agreed without particular concern. "Doesn't that bother you?" He set the spoon down and turned to look at her properly. "Margaret, I've been a subject of town conversation since I was 19 years old, and my father lost this ranch in a card game, and I bought it back by working 3 straight years without a day off. People in Harlow Creek have been talking about me my entire adult life. I've stopped listening." She set down the bread knife. "What did they say?" "When you were working to get it back. That I was a fool. That it couldn't be done. That a Callahan couldn't hold land." He picked up the spoon again. "It took me 4 years, not 3, but I got it back." Margaret looked at him. "You really don't care what people think," she said. And it wasn't an accusation, it was something closer to wonder. Because she had spent her entire life caring tremendously what people thought, and it had never done her a single good. "I care what's true," he said. "The rest is just noise." So, they ate at the kitchen table, the two of them, with the fire going and the wind picking up outside, and it should have been unbearably strange, 2 strangers sharing a meal in a house that one of them owned and the other had no claim to whatsoever. But it wasn't strange. Or rather, it was strange, but underneath the strangeness, there was something that felt oddly right, like 2 puzzle pieces from different boxes that happened against all logic to fit together at one edge. Pete Hadley knocked, took his supper to the bunkhouse. The quiet came back. Tell me about the ranch, Margaret said. What needs doing? Ethan looked up from his bowl. What needs doing? I'm not going to sit here and eat your food and do nothing, she said. Even if it's just for a few days. I'm not made that way. So tell me what needs doing. He studied her for a moment. The chickens need tending in the morning. The garden beds need turning when the ground softens in March. The house... He hesitated. The house needs things I haven't had time to give it. A woman's eye, I suppose. Though I don't mean that in a dismissive way. I know you don't, she said. There's a mare who's close to foaling. She's been off her feed, and I don't like the look of her. I've been sitting up with her the past 3 nights. Margaret set down her spoon. By yourself. Pete helps when he can, but he's got enough to manage. Show me what to watch for, she said. I can sit with her. He looked at her steadily for a moment. You've been on a train for 2 days, he said. You just arrived in a place you've never been in circumstances that are... He searched for the word unusual. You don't need to prove anything tonight. I'm not proving anything, she said. I just don't sleep well, and it sounds like you need the rest more than I do. It was true. She could see it on him, the particular exhaustion of someone who had been running on will and caffeine for too long, the way the lines around his eyes had deepened. He wasn't a complaining man, but the tiredness was there. He was quiet for a moment. Her name is Rosie, he said. I'll show you what to watch for. They went to the barn after supper, Margaret in her coat, Ethan with a lantern, and he showed her the mare. Rosie was a big chestnut, heavily pregnant, shifting restlessly in her stall. She tossed her head when they came in, then settled when Ethan put his hand on her neck and spoke quietly to her. She's getting close, he said. Watch her breathing. If she starts to sweat and lie down and get back up more than twice in an hour, you come get me immediately. Don't wait. Come straight to the house. All right, Margaret said, and talk to her. He said it simply without embarrassment. She does better when someone talks to her. Margaret looked at the horse, then at the man beside her, and she thought, this man is kinder than he knows. He left her with the lantern and a 3-legged stool and went back to the house to sleep. Margaret pulled the stool up to the outside of the stall and sat down. Rosie shifted and snorted. All right, Margaret said quietly. It's just us. My name is Margaret. I'm not exactly sure what I'm doing here either, but I think we're both just going to have to trust someone a little and see what happens. The mare turned her big dark eye toward her. Margaret put her hand through the slats of the stall door, and after a long moment, Rosie came forward and pressed her nose against it. She didn't fetch Ethan that night. Rosie wasn't ready yet, just restless the way expecting mothers are uncomfortable in the final days of waiting. Margaret talked to her off and on through the long hours, telling her about Boston and about the train journey, and about a man named Ethan Callahan who had said maybe the wrong bride is exactly the right one and hadn't explained what he meant by it. Around 3 a.m, Margaret fell asleep on the stool with her head against the stall door. That was how Ethan found her at 5:30 when he came to check. He stood in the doorway of the barn for a moment, holding his lantern, looking at this woman, this stranger who had arrived on his platform with an apology and a worn suitcase and had spent her first night in Montana sitting with his horse because she'd said she didn't sleep well. He had been angry, he realized. Not at her, he hadn't lied about that, but at the situation. At Clara Whitmore, whom he'd never meet, who had treated a man's hope like a joke. At himself for being hopeful in the first place. But standing in the doorway, looking at Margaret Ellis, who had done exactly what she said she'd do, who had stayed exactly where she'd said she'd stay, the anger went somewhere quieter. He set the lantern on the hook by the door. He went to Rosie, first checked her over carefully, satisfied himself that she was stable and simply waiting. Then he went to Margaret and touched her shoulder lightly. She startled awake immediately. Is she said, reaching for the stall door. She's fine, Ethan said. She's fine. You can go inside now. Get some sleep. Margaret blinked at him, still half asleep, and something crossed her face, a raw, unguarded something, that she immediately pulled back behind composure. I said I would stay, she said. You did, he agreed. You stayed. Now I'm telling you to go get warm. She stood up slowly, stiff from the cold and the awkward position. She smoothed her coat. How is she really? Margaret asked, looking at Rosie. Another day, maybe two? He said. She's close. Margaret nodded. Wake me if she starts. He looked at her. Margaret, he said. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, she said, and her voice was clear and direct and unafraid. I want to. That's different. She picked up her lantern and walked past him toward the house. He watched her go. He stood in the barn for a long time after she disappeared through the door, with the smell of hay and the quiet breathing of animals around him, and something he hadn't felt in a very long time settled into the center of his chest. Not love, not yet, not even certainty, just the feeling that something important had just arrived, and that it was going to change everything. Chin. The next morning, Harlow Creek was talking. By the time Margaret came downstairs at 8 o'clock later than she'd intended, the warmth of the bed having pulled her under for longer than expected, Ethan had already been to town for feed and back, and he came in the door with a look on his face that she recognized. The look of a man who has heard something that requires him to decide how to respond. He set down the feed sacks in the mudroom. He said without preamble, People are saying I was made a fool of. Margaret went still. Edna Ferris has been at the general store since 6 this morning. He continued, his voice completely even, letting everyone know that she saw Ethan Callahan standing on the platform, waiting for a beautiful woman from the East, and getting her words, not mine, a plain little thing with a suitcase and a story. Margaret felt the heat come up in her face, not from embarrassment, or not only from that. I'm sorry, she said. Don't apologize, he said. He looked at her directly. I need to know what you want to do, because the way I see it, you have 2 choices. You can let me drive you to the next town over where the stage goes south twice a week, and you can go wherever you were going when this all falls apart. I'll give you money for the ticket. No hard feelings. She waited. Or he said, you can stay. And we can see what this becomes. But if you stay knowing it won't be easy. People are going to be unkind. The work is hard. I don't make promises I can't keep, and I won't promise you this ends well. I'll only promise you that I'll be straight with you. Always. The kitchen was very quiet. Margaret looked at this man who had offered her twice now the choice to leave, who had not once since she'd arrived made her feel like an obligation or a burden or a mistake. She thought about Boston, about the man who had looked at her and seen something useful, about 28 years of being the plain one, the quiet one, the one no one chose. She thought about a mare named Rosie who had pressed her nose into a stranger's hand in the middle of the night. I'll stay, she said. Ethan nodded. Once. Then we should eat breakfast, he said. There's a fence line needs checking before the next snow. She didn't understand that first morning that she had just made the decision that would remake her entire life. She didn't understand that the man currently frying eggs at the stove was going to become the person she trusted more than anyone she had ever known. She didn't understand that this rough, quiet, weathered ranch at the edge of Montana, this place that had looked from the wagon like a thing that had been loved and let go, was going to become, before the year was out, the only home she had ever really had. She just ate breakfast. And then she went to check on Rosie. And the life that was waiting for her, the one she hadn't known she was coming to, began. The fence line took 4 hours. Margaret hadn't expected to go with him. She'd assumed he meant it as a figure of speech, the kind of thing men said at breakfast to signal that real life was resuming, that there was work to be done, and the world wasn't going to pause just because 2 strangers had decided over eggs to attempt something neither of them could fully name. But when she came back inside from checking on Rosie, Ethan was standing by the door with 2 pairs of work gloves and a look that said he was waiting for her. You said you wanted work, he said. This is work. She took the gloves. She didn't complain once during those 4 hours. Even when the cold got into the spaces between her collar and her jaw, even when the ground was uneven, and she stumbled twice trying to keep up with his pace. She didn't pretend the work was easy either. When a post came loose, and the wire snapped back and caught her across the back of her hand, she said one sharp word that surprised him, one word low and quick, and then pressed her hand against her coat and kept moving. Ethan noticed that. He noticed most things about her he was finding. It wasn't the noticing of a man looking for something to admire. It was the noticing of a man who had spent 20 years reading the land for signs of what was coming, and who now found, without entirely meaning to, that he was applying the same attention to the woman walking beside him. On the way back to the ranch, she said, "Who owned the land to the east before you bought it back?" He glanced at her sideways. "Why do you ask?" "Because the fence line you're maintaining runs about 30 yards short of where I'd expect it to run based on the tree line. Either someone moved it, or someone let you believe you owned less than you do." He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. "What made you notice that?" he said. "My father was a surveyor," she said, "before everything changed. I used to walk lines with him on weekends when I was small. I know what a property boundary looks like when it's where it should be." She looked at him steadily. "That one isn't." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. He looked east. His jaw worked slowly. "Victor Blackwell," he said. The name came out the way you'd say the name of a headache that had been going on for 6 months. "Who is he?" "The largest landowner in this county." He started walking again, and his pace had changed, less easy, more contained. "He's been trying to buy me out for 3 years. I keep saying no. Last spring he had a crew come out and tell me my eastern fence line needed to be moved back due to a survey discrepancy. I didn't have the money to fight it, so I moved it." Margaret let that settle. "And you believed him." "I didn't have reason not to." "You do now," she said. He looked at her again. That same careful reading look. "You've been here less than 24 hours, he said. "I know," she said. "I'm sorry if that was presumptuous." "Don't apologize," he said, and the words came out with enough firmness that she understood he wasn't being polite. He actually meant it. "Don't apologize for being right." They walked the rest of the way back in silence, but it was a different silence than the mornings. It had weight to it. Direction. Inside that silence, something was shifting. Neither of them mentioned it. Rosie Fold on the 3rd day. Margaret was there when it happened, had been sitting with the mare through most of the night talking to her the way Ethan had suggested, low, and even the kind of voice you used with frightened things. When Rosie's breathing changed, and she went down, Margaret didn't panic. She went to the house and knocked hard on Ethan's door, and he was up and moving before she finished knocking, dressed in under a minute, in the way of a man who had been sleeping lightly for days. They were in the barn together when the foal arrived, small and wet and furiously alive, legs going in every direction, Rosie turning and turning to find it. Ethan was on his knees in the straw, guiding the foal, making sure the airway was clear, and Margaret was at Rosie's head, keeping the mare calm with her hand and her voice. And for those 20 minutes, there was no strangeness between them, and no uncertainty. There was just work, and the two of them doing it together without needing to discuss who did what. When the foal stood for the first time, wobbling furious, improbably determined, Ethan sat back on his heels and let out a long breath. He looked over at Margaret. She was watching the foal with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before. Not the careful composure she'd been maintaining since she arrived. Something unguarded. Something that was almost joy. "You did good," he said. She looked at him, startled, like she'd forgotten he was there. "We both did," she said. He almost smiled. "Almost." "She needs a name," he said, nodding at the foal. Margaret looked back at the small, staggering animal. "Hope," she said immediately, like it had been waiting. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Hope," he repeated. "Is that too much?" she asked. "No," he said. "It's exactly right." She had been at the ranch for 6 days when the first person from town came to call. It was Ruth Hadley Pete's mother, a wide woman with sharp eyes, and a warmth she tried to disguise as nosiness. She arrived at the door with a covered dish and a particular quality of attention that Margaret recognized immediately. This was a woman who had come to assess the situation and form an opinion. And the opinion would be delivered to half the county by nightfall. Ethan wasn't home. He'd gone to the feed store and wouldn't be back until afternoon. Margaret opened the door herself. Ruth Hadley looked at her, looked at the dish in her own hands, and made a decision. "I'm Ruth," she said. "I brought stew. Can I come in?" "Of course," Margaret said. "I'll put the kettle on." They sat at the kitchen table with tea and the stew warming on the stove. And for the first 10 minutes, Ruth asked the kind of questions that weren't really questions, they were tests. "Where are you from? How long were you and Clara Whitmore acquainted? Do you have family in the area?" The kind of probing that masquerades as friendliness and is actually inventory. Margaret answered everything directly. She didn't offer more than was asked, and she didn't retreat either. Then Ruth put down her cup and said plainly, "Are you going to stay?" "That's between Mr. Callahan and me," Margaret said. "People are saying he was tricked." "People are wrong," Margaret said. "He was told the truth on the platform the moment I arrived. He made his own decision. He's not a man who gets tricked." Ruth studied her. "No," she said slowly. "He's not." She picked up her cup again. "He's also not a man who's had an easy time of it. He's worked this ranch alone since his father left and his brothers moved east. He doesn't ask for help. He doesn't complain. He just keeps going." She paused. "I've been watching him do that for 15 years. And I've been watching him get lonelier every year while he does it. So when I heard he'd written away for a bride, I thought finally. And then I heard what happened on that platform." Margaret said nothing. "I want to know if you're going to hurt him," Ruth said. "That's all. That's the only reason I'm here." Margaret looked at her directly. "I don't intend to." "Intentions aren't the same as outcomes." "No?" Margaret agreed. "They're not. But I don't have anywhere else to go, and I'm not a woman who leaves when things get difficult. I don't have the luxury." She paused. "And he's been kind to me. I don't forget kindness." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded once like a decision had been made. "The stew has a bay leaf in it," she said. "Pull it out before you serve it, or Ethan will chew on it and not say a word, and you'll think he liked it." Margaret almost laughed. She pressed her lips together instead. "Thank you for telling me," she said. Ethan came home to find Ruth Hadley's buggy still in the yard, and he walked into the kitchen with the particular caution of a man who understood that two women sitting at his kitchen table was either very good news or very bad news, and there was no middle ground. He looked at Margaret, then at Ruth. "Ruth," he said. "Ethan," she said. "Sit down, I'll pour you tea." "I don't want tea, Ruth." "You look like you need it." He sat down. Ruth poured him tea. Margaret watched this exchange with something that might have been the first genuine amusement she'd felt in weeks, and she kept it carefully off her face. Ruth stayed another hour. She talked about the spring planting, about Pete's upcoming birthday, about the new school teacher who had arrived in October and was allegedly very good with difficult children. She talked about everything except the obvious thing, which was that she had come to measure Margaret Ellis, and had apparently decided she would do. When she left, she pressed Margaret's hand at the door. "Church is Sunday," she said. "If you want company when you go, come find me first." Margaret looked at her. "I wasn't planning to go to church." "I know," Ruth said. "That's why I'm telling you. Don't let them see you hiding. They'll think you have something to be ashamed of." She lowered her voice slightly. "And if Edna Ferris says anything to you, you look her straight in the eye, and you don't look away first. She respects that, even if she'd never admit it." She left. Ethan appeared behind Margaret in the doorway. "Ruth likes you," he said with a note of what might have been genuine surprise. "I noticed," Margaret said. "Ruth doesn't like anyone," he said. "I noticed that too." He looked at her sideways. "What did you say to her?" "The truth," Margaret said. Mostly. She went back to the kitchen. "I told her I wasn't planning to leave." He followed her slowly. "And is that true?" She turned around and faced him. "I told you I'd stay," she said. "I meant it. I don't say things I don't mean, Ethan. I know we don't know each other well enough for you to know that yet, but you'll figure it out." He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her. This woman who had been on his property for less than a week, who had walked his fence line and noticed what a man with a grudge had done to his eastern boundary, who had sat up with his mare through 3 cold nights and named the full hope, and meant it without any irony. And he felt something very specific and very inconvenient begin to take root in his chest. He ignored it. He said, "There's a bay leaf in that stew." "I know," she said. "I already took it out." Chink. The following Sunday she went to church. She went alone because Ethan was not a church-going man, which was a fact about him she had learned without being surprised by it. She dressed carefully. She didn't have much, but she had enough, and she walked the 2 miles to town because she'd decided she wasn't going to ask anyone for a ride, and she wasn't going to arrive as someone who needed accommodating. She arrived 3 minutes before the service started and took a seat in the 3rd row. She felt every eye in the building. She kept her spine straight and her face calm, and she sang the hymns because she knew them and because her voice was better than she usually let on. And she shook hands at the door afterward and said her name clearly. Margaret Ellis. Yes, from Boston. Yes, I'm staying at the Callahan Ranch. Yes, it's a pleasure to meet you, and she didn't flinch once. Edna Ferris found her in the churchyard. Edna was a tall woman with the particular authority of someone who had been the most important social arbiter in a small town for 30 years and intended to remain so. She looked Margaret up and down. "You're the woman who came instead of Clara Whitmore," she said. Not a question. "I am," Margaret said. "People are saying Ethan Callahan was taken advantage of." "People are wrong," Margaret said. "He knew exactly who I was, and he chose to let me stay. He's a grown man. He doesn't need protecting from his own decisions." Edna raised an eyebrow. "And what do you bring to this situation exactly?" Margaret looked at her without blinking. "I work hard, I keep my word, and I don't gossip. I understand those may be unfamiliar qualities in some circles." There was a silence. Then, astonishingly, Edna Ferris made a sound that was almost a laugh. It didn't quite make it all the way there, but it got close. "Come to the ladies' auxiliary meeting on Thursday," she said. It was not an invitation. It was an assessment dressed as one. "I'll think about it," Margaret said. She walked home 2 miles in the cold, and she felt for the first time since she'd stepped off that train, like the ground under her feet might actually hold. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, 11 days after Margaret had come to Harlow Creek. Ethan brought it in from the mailbox without comment, set it on the table where Margaret would see it. He didn't say anything. He just went to pour himself coffee, and he stood by the window with his back to her in a way that was so carefully neutral it told her immediately that he'd already read the return address. She looked at the envelope. Boston. Her stomach dropped. She picked it up. The handwriting on the front was unfamiliar, precise, and commercial, the handwriting of a lawyer's clerk. She opened it. She read it once. Then she set it on the table and looked at the window at Ethan's back. "It's from Harrison Whitfield's law firm," she said. Ethan turned around. "The man you were running from. The man whose son I was supposed to marry." She kept her voice even. "He's had a private inquiry done. He knows where I am." She paused. "He's informing me that I am in breach of a verbal agreement and that I have until the 1st of March to return to Boston and honor my obligations, or he will pursue legal remedy." The kitchen was very quiet. "What does legal remedy mean?" Ethan said. "It means he'll find something to use against me," she said. "He's a man with a great deal of money and a great deal of pride, and I've embarrassed him by disappearing. He doesn't actually want me back. He wants to make it painful enough that I come back on my own." Ethan set his coffee down. He said, "Is there anything in that letter that actually holds legal weight?" "I don't know. Possibly not. A verbal agreement about a marriage isn't exactly enforceable." She paused. "But his lawyers are better than my nothing." "He doesn't know you're here specifically. The return address is the firm. But if he's had an inquiry done..." She stopped. He knows I got on the train. He probably knows I was on my way to Montana. It won't take long. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Margaret, look at me." She looked at him. "You are on my property," he said. "You are under my roof. I don't care how much money Harrison Whitfield has. He has no standing in Montana, and whatever he's threatening you with from Boston doesn't hold here." He picked up the letter, folded it, and held it out to her. "But I need you to tell me everything. Not the version you've been giving me, the short version with the edges taken off. The whole thing. Because if something is coming for you, I need to know what it is." She looked at him. "If I tell you everything," she said carefully, "you may decide this isn't worth the trouble." "Let me decide that," he said. She pulled out a chair, she sat down, and she began to tell him the truth. Her father had been, as she'd said, a surveyor. A good one, respected in Boston's professional circles, with enough clients to keep a comfortable house and 2 daughters in decent schools. Her mother had died when Margaret was 12, and the household had gone on reduced, quieter, but functional. Her father had done his work and done it honestly, and Margaret had grown up believing that honesty was a reasonable way to live. Then her father had taken on Harrison Whitfield as a client. Whitfield had wanted survey work done on 3 properties he was acquiring in the south of the state. Her father had done the work, and in doing the work, he had discovered that 2 of the properties had boundary disputes that had been deliberately obscured. Disputes that, if properly surfaced, would have significantly reduced the value of what Whitfield was buying and significantly increased the legal liability of the man selling them. Her father had, because he was an honest man, reported what he found. "He lost everything in 18 months, Margaret said. Her voice was flat and careful, the voice of someone who has told themselves this story so many times that they've burned off the rawness of it. His reputation, his clients. There were accusations, fabricated ones, that he'd made errors in previous surveys. Whitfield had reach. He had friends in the right offices." She paused. "By the time my father died, we had nothing. I was 22. My sister had already married and moved to Ohio. I had nowhere to go." "So you went to work for the Whitfields," Ethan said. "For a family that socialized with the Whitfields," she said. "The Hargraves. They needed a companion for their eldest daughter. It was fine. Better than the alternatives." She looked at her hands. "And then Clara Whitmore started writing letters to a rancher in Montana, and her family thought it was charming and harmless. And then suddenly it wasn't harmless anymore. Clara was serious about going, and her family was furious, and Harrison Whitfield saw an opportunity." Ethan went very still. "He knew about the correspondence," he said. "His son did. Gerald Whitfield is—" She searched for the word weak. "Not cruel exactly, just weak in the way that men become weak when they've had everything given to them, and they've never had to earn anything, and they've learned that wanting something means having it." She paused. "Gerald decided he wanted me, and his father decided it was tidy, the surveyor's daughter grateful for the opportunity, malleable. A woman who understood what happened to people who caused the Whitfields trouble. And you said no." "I said no," she agreed. "And Clara?" Clara thought it was the funniest thing she'd ever heard. She thought I was a fool. She said, "Go to Montana Maggie. Go be some Cowboy's charity case. At least you'll be out of Gerald's reach." She stopped. The kitchen was very quiet. Ethan had not moved throughout the whole of this. He was sitting across from her, with his elbows on the table, and his hands folded and his eyes on her face, and he had not shown any of the reactions she'd been bracing for. No pity, no calculation, no visible reassessment of whether she was more trouble than she was worth. He just listened. And when she finished, he said, "He destroyed your father." "Yes." "And then he tried to use you to clean it up." "Yes." "And you left anyway, knowing he had the means to come after you." "I left anyway," she said, "because staying wasn't living. It was just waiting to disappear." Ethan unfolded his hands. He said quietly, but with a certainty that left no room for argument, "He's not going to touch you here." Margaret looked at him. "Ethan, I'm not making you a promise I can't keep," he said. "I'm telling you what's true. This is my land. He has no authority here. And if he sends men to my property—" His voice didn't rise, didn't heat, stayed exactly as level as it had been all along, which somehow made it more convincing, not less. They will leave the same way they came, considerably less comfortable. She stared at him. She said very quietly, "Why would you do that? I'm not your responsibility. I came here by accident. You didn't ask for this." He looked at her steadily. "No," he said. "I didn't ask for any of it." He paused. "But you're here, and you've been straight with me. And a man who won't protect someone in his own house when they need protecting isn't a man worth the name." She felt something crack just slightly in the wall she'd been maintaining since Boston. She looked down at the table. "I didn't come here to be saved," she said. "I know that," he said. "I'm not saving you. I'm just standing in the same place." She didn't say anything. He stood up and went to get more coffee, and when he came back, he refilled her cup without asking. And that small, ordinary act, the simplest possible gesture of being considered, was the thing that finally made her eyes sting. She didn't let him see it, but she felt it. Victor Blackwell came to the ranch on a Friday afternoon, and he didn't come alone. He came with two men Margaret didn't recognize, and a friendliness that didn't reach his eyes, and he stood on the porch with his hat in his hands and smiled at Ethan in the way of a man who considers smiling a tool rather than an expression. Margaret had seen men like him before. In Boston, they wore better suits, but the architecture was the same. She stayed in the doorway and watched. "Callahan," Victor said. "Good to see you. I heard you had company. Thought I'd stop by and welcome your guest." The word had a pause before it that was deliberately sized to carry maximum implication. Ethan said, "What do you want, Victor?" Victor's smile adjusted slightly. He glanced at Margaret, then back at Ethan, and the glance said everything. He was too careful to say out loud. "I know about the woman. I know what people are saying. I know you're vulnerable right now. Just being neighborly," Victor said. "I also wanted to revisit our conversation about the eastern parcels. Given that you've had some changes in your circumstances, I thought you might be reconsidering your position on the sale." "My position hasn't changed," Ethan said. "Land prices won't stay where they are," Victor said pleasantly. "I'm offering you something fair, more than fair. And between you and me, Ethan, a man in your situation might want to think about liquidity. A ranch is a lot to manage alone." Margaret watched Ethan's jaw shift. She watched him hold still. She understood what Victor was doing, the careful, smiling version of a threat. "You're alone. You're struggling. The town is laughing at you. Take the money and go." She'd seen it done to her father. The same architecture, the same smile. She stepped forward. Not dramatically, not into the conversation. Just one step forward into the doorway so that she was visible and clearly present and not incidentally placed. Victor looked at her. "Miss Ellis, is it?" he said. The fact that he knew her name was not accidental. "Mrs. Callahan," she said. It came out before she'd decided to say it. Completely level, completely calm, as if it were the most ordinary fact in the world. There was a silence. Ethan didn't move. Victor's smile stayed exactly where it was, but something behind his eyes recalculated. "I see," he said. "My husband's position on the sale hasn't changed," Margaret said. "And I don't expect it will. But thank you for stopping by." She paused, just a fraction of a second. "I'll pass your regards to Pete Hadley. His mother mentioned you two are acquainted." Victor looked at her for a moment longer. Then he put his hat back on and said, "Callahan, ladies?" And he walked back to his horse. When the sound of hoofbeats had faded, Margaret turned around. Ethan was standing in the doorway looking at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. She said before he could speak, "I know, I overstepped." He said, "Mrs. Callahan." "I know," she said, heat rising in her face. "I'm sorry. I don't know why I—" "Margaret." "I'll take it back if you want. I can send a note or—" "Margaret." His voice was patient and firm, and just slightly amused, which was the last thing she'd expected. "I'm not angry." She stopped. "You should have let me handle it," he said. "But you're not wrong that it worked." He looked past her in the direction Blackwell had gone. He came here to see weakness. He saw something else. She exhaled slowly. "He's going to come back," she said. "Yes," he said. "He is. He's not going to stop just because of a title I don't officially have." "No," he agreed. "He's not." She looked at him. He looked at her. "Then we need to figure out the fence line," she said. "And we need to find someone who can prove it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "My father kept all his land records. Deed surveys, everything. They're in a box in the back room. I haven't looked at them in years." "Then we should look at them tonight," she said. He turned and went inside. She followed, and neither of them mentioned not yet what she'd called herself on the porch. But it was there between them, that word Callahan, like a door that had been opened just enough to let in light, and neither of them was ready to walk through it, but neither of them was moving to close it either. They found the survey records at 10 o'clock that night. Margaret was the one who found them in a wooden box under a shelf of account ledgers, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth that had kept them dry through 2 decades of Montana winters. She carried them to the kitchen table and spread them out carefully, and Ethan put the lantern between them, and they leaned over the papers together. Her father had taught her to read survey records the way some fathers taught their daughters to read music. Naturally, as a matter of course. She found the discrepancy in under 10 minutes. "Here," she said. Her finger traced a line on the oldest survey dated 1871. Her father's style of notation immediately readable to her in a way she hadn't expected to feel in her chest. "This is your eastern boundary. This is where it is and has always been." She moved her finger to a second document, newer, less carefully made. "And this is what Blackwell's man filed last spring. He moved it 32 yards. Ethan stared at the 2 documents. 32 yards, he repeated. "Across that entire boundary, yes. Which means," she did the calculation in her head, "roughly 6 acres of land that belongs to you is currently being treated as his." Ethan sat back. He said one word, quiet and controlled, that she'd only heard him say once before. She understood. "We need a surveyor to verify it," she said. "Someone Blackwell can't get to." "The nearest independent surveyor is in Billings," he said. "Then we write to Billings," she said. "And we do it tomorrow." He looked at her across the papers, across the evidence of what someone had tried to steal from him, and the intelligence that had found it, and he said quietly, "You found this. From 32 yards of fence line." "My father taught me what to look for," she said. "No." He shook his head slowly. "Your father taught you the skill. You chose to use it." He paused. "You didn't have to do this, Margaret. This isn't your fight." She looked at him steadily. "I called myself Mrs. Callahan on your front porch today," she said. "I think that makes it my fight." He held her gaze. And for the first time since she'd arrived, since that cold platform, since maybe the wrong bride is exactly the right one, she saw something shift behind his eyes that was neither patience nor caution, nor the careful neutrality of a man protecting himself. It was something warmer. Something that hadn't been there or hadn't been visible before tonight. He looked down at the survey records. "I'll write the letter," he said. "We'll write it together," she said. He almost smiled. She pulled the paper toward her and picked up the pen. Outside, the wind had picked up again, carrying the particular cold of a Montana night that was building toward something snow or change or both. Inside the kitchen, the lantern burned steady and warm, and 2 people who had arrived at each other entirely by accident bent over a table full of evidence and began quietly and without ceremony to build something that neither of them had a name for yet, but that both of them already knew they weren't willing to lose. The letter to Billings went out on a Wednesday morning, and then there was nothing to do but wait. Margaret had learned in the weeks since she'd arrived that waiting was one of the things Ethan Callahan did better than almost anyone she'd ever met. He didn't pace. He didn't speculate out loud. He didn't fill silence with worry the way most people did. He simply went about the work of the ranch with the same steady focus he brought to everything, and he trusted that what needed to happen would happen in its own time. Margaret was not built that way. She had her father's mind restless, always turning the problem, looking for the angle she might have missed. She woke at 5 every morning. Now the ranch's rhythm having replaced her city habits entirely without her quite noticing. And by the time Ethan came downstairs, she'd already fed the chickens, checked on Hope, and made coffee strong enough to hold a spoon upright. He noticed this. He didn't comment on it, but he noticed. What had changed between them since the night of the survey records was not something either of them would have been able to describe precisely. It wasn't romance, not exactly they were careful with each other in a way that romance didn't usually permit. But it was something. A ease. A falling into step that happened so naturally that Margaret sometimes caught herself in the middle of an ordinary moment, handing him a tool, finishing a sentence he'd started turning, to tell him something that had just occurred to her, and realized that the ordinary felt somehow extraordinary. She told herself it was gratitude. She told herself it was circumstance. She told herself a great many things that were probably partly true and mostly incomplete. She did not tell herself the thing that was most true, which was that she had stopped trying to remember that she was a guest. Ethan, for his part, had stopped trying to remember it too. Neither of them mentioned that either. Then Pete Hadley came in from the eastern boundary on a Thursday morning with a look on his face that Margaret had learned to read, the look of a man carrying bad news he hasn't yet found the right way to say. He pulled off his hat when he came through the kitchen door. He looked at Ethan. He looked at Margaret. He looked at his hat. "There are stakes in the ground," he said. "New stakes, out along the eastern line." Ethan set down his coffee. "Where exactly?" he said. It wasn't a question. Past the corrected line. Past even the line Blackwell moved us to last spring. Pete's jaw worked. If those stakes are what I think they are, he's claiming another 20 yards. The kitchen went quiet. Margaret did the math in her head without meaning to. Another 20 yards. Across the full eastern boundary. That was nearly 4 more acres. Combined with what he'd already taken, Blackwell was trying to claim almost 10 acres of Callahan land. And he was doing it incrementally, each move small enough to dispute individually, but cumulatively enormous. She said, "He knows we wrote to Billings." Both men looked at her. "Think about the timing," she said. "The letter went out Wednesday. It's Thursday morning. He has someone watching." Ethan's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes went very still in the way that things go still right before they move. "Pete," he said. "Yeah. Don't touch the stakes. Leave them exactly where they are." Pete frowned. "Ethan, leave them," he said again. "Let him think it worked. Let him think we didn't notice, or that we noticed and we're not going to fight it." He picked up his coffee again deliberately, as if the conversation were already over. "Let him get comfortable." Pete looked at Margaret. Margaret looked at Ethan. "You want him to overreach," she said. "I want him to show everyone exactly what he's doing," Ethan said. "1 move is a dispute. 3 moves is a pattern." He set down the cup. "We just need to make sure someone credible is watching when he makes the 3rd one." Margaret thought about her father, about how he had reported what he'd found honestly and through the right channels, and it had cost him everything because the right channels were full of Whitfield's people. She thought about what she'd learned from that, not to stop being honest, but to understand that honesty needed witnesses. "The surveyor from Billings," she said. "We need him here before Blackwell makes the next move." "I'll ride to the telegraph office this afternoon," Ethan said. "I'll come with you," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. It was the first time he hadn't suggested she stay at the ranch. She noticed that too. The telegraph office in Harlow Creek was run by a man named Douglas Fenn, who was simultaneously the most informed and most discreet person in the county, a combination that made him invaluable and slightly unsettling. He took their message without reading it aloud, which Margaret appreciated, and told them a reply could be expected by tomorrow noon if the Billings office was operating at normal capacity. They were walking back to the wagon when Ethan stopped. Margaret nearly walked into him. She followed his sightline. Across the street, leaning against the post outside the general store, was a man she didn't recognize, heavy-set, well-dressed for Harlow Creek, watching them with the particular quality of attention that wasn't casual. He had the look of someone who had been told to observe and report, and who wasn't especially skilled at doing it without being obvious. "Do you know him?" she asked. "No," Ethan said. "But I know who sent him." He stood for a moment longer, just long enough to make it clear to the man across the street that he'd been seen. Then he turned and helped Margaret up to the wagon bench and climbed up himself and picked up the reins entirely unhurried. "Blackwell is escalating," Margaret said as they pulled out. "Yes. Which means he's feeling pressure. Which means," Ethan said, the letter to Billings scared him. Margaret thought about that. A man who had been quietly stealing land for 3 years, one survey adjustment at a time, suddenly scared by a letter from a ranch he'd assumed was too weak to push back. She thought about what that fear would make him do. "He's going to move faster now," she said. "He was patient when he thought he had time. He won't be patient anymore." Ethan glanced at her sideways. "You think like a strategist. I think like someone who watched a powerful man destroy my father by moving carefully and then quickly," she said. "The quick part is where they make mistakes." He was quiet for a moment. "Your father," he said. "Tell me what he was like." The question surprised her. Not its content, she'd told him the facts of her father's story, but the gentleness of it. The way it asked not for information, but for something more personal. "He was methodical," she said. "He didn't talk very much. He was more comfortable with numbers and measurements than with conversation. But he was completely honest. It was the thing he was proudest of." She paused. "He used to say a survey is only as good as the man who does it. You can fudge numbers, you can miss things deliberately, and no one may ever know. But you know. And that's the thing that undoes you eventually." Ethan listened. "He never recovered from what Whitfield did to him," she said. "Not because of the money or the reputation. Because he couldn't understand how a man could know what he was doing and keep doing it." She looked at her hands in her lap. "I used to think that was a weakness in him, that he was too innocent. Now I think it was the best thing about him." The wagon moved through the cold air. Ethan said, "He sounds like someone worth being angry for." Her throat tightened. She pressed her lips together. "Yes," she said. "He was." They didn't speak again until they got back to the ranch. But it was the kind of silence that was full rather than empty, and Margaret understood somewhere in the part of her that was learning to trust small things that Ethan Callahan had just asked about her father, not because it was useful to the situation, but because he wanted to know. That was different from everything she was used to. That was the thing that scared her most. The reply from Billings came the following morning, not by noon but by 9 o'clock, which told Margaret the surveyor was either very efficient or had been waiting for exactly this kind of work. His name was Thomas Garrett. He could be in Harlow Creek by Monday. His fee was $30, and he would require access to all original land documents and physical access to the disputed boundary. Ethan read the telegram, folded it, put it in his coat pocket. "Monday," he said. "That's 4 days," Margaret said. "A lot can happen in 4 days. Then we need to make sure the documents are organized before he arrives." She paused. "And we need to make sure Blackwell doesn't know he's coming until it's too late to interfere." Ethan looked at her. "How do you propose we do that?" "Douglas Fenn," she said. "He didn't read our message out loud. Did he read the reply out loud?" "No." "Then he's trustworthy, or at least professional." She thought for a moment. But Blackwell's man was watching the telegraph office. He knows we sent and received something. He doesn't know what. No. She folded her hands. But he'll guess, which means Blackwell will guess. She looked up at Ethan. We need to act like nothing has changed. Go about the normal routine. Don't go back to the telegraph office. Don't ride the eastern boundary again. She paused. Let him think we got a bad answer. Let him think the surveyor isn't coming. Ethan studied her for a long moment. You've thought about this before, he said. This kind of maneuvering. I spent 6 years in a house full of people who maneuvered, she said. I didn't participate, but I watched. I learned what it looked like when someone was winning and pretending to lose. And what does it look like? She met his eyes. It looks like this. He almost smiled. It was the closest he'd come in several days, and it did something unreasonable to her composure that she immediately suppressed. All right, he said. We do it your way. So, the 4 days passed. The way that tense days always pass too slowly when you were watching for trouble, and too quickly when you realized how much still needed to be done. Margaret organized the land documents into a sequence that Thomas Garrett could follow without explanation. She cross-referenced the original survey against the secondary one and wrote clear notations in the margins, precise, evidenced the kind of notations her father would have recognized. She did it without being asked and without announcing that she was doing it, and when Ethan came in on Sunday evening and found the documents laid out on the kitchen table in perfect order, he stood looking at them for a long time without saying anything. Then he said, Margaret. Yes. This is... He stopped. Started again. I couldn't have done this. You could have, she said. It would have taken you longer, and you'd have had to learn to read my father's notation style first. That's not what I mean. She looked up at him. He was looking at the documents, not at her, and the expression on his face was the one she'd started to recognize as his most honest one, the one that came when he wasn't managing himself, when something had gotten through before he could decide how to receive it. I've been carrying this alone for 3 years, he said. The boundary, Blackwell, all of it. He paused. I didn't know how much of it I'd put down until just now. The kitchen was very quiet. She said carefully because she meant it, and she didn't want to make it more than it was. You don't have to carry things alone anymore. Whatever this is, whatever we are, that's still true. He looked at her then. The look was very direct and very undefended, and it lasted long enough that she felt it in her sternum. He said, I know. And then Pete knocked on the back door asking about the evening feed situation, and the moment broke, and they both moved back into the ordinary current of the evening as if nothing had shifted. But it had. Something had shifted, and they both knew it, and neither of them was pretending otherwise anymore. Thomas Garrett arrived on Monday morning as promised, a small, brisk man in his 50s with a leather satchel and the permanently squinting expression of someone who spent most of his professional life looking at the ground. He shook Ethan's hand, shook Margaret's hand without apparent surprise at her presence, and sat down at the kitchen table with the organized documents and started reading without preamble. Margaret liked him immediately. He spent 2 hours with the paperwork before he said a single word. Then he looked up and said, Whoever organized these knew what they were doing. My wife, Ethan said. Margaret went very still. It was the first time he'd used that word. Not Mrs. Callahan the way she'd used it on the porch as a tactical maneuver. Wife, said plainly without hesitation in a context where there was no tactical reason to say it. Said as if it were simply true. Thomas Garrett nodded. Good. This'll make the field work faster. He looked at Ethan. I'll need to walk the boundary this afternoon. All of it. And I'll need you to show me exactly where Blackwell's stakes are without moving them. Understood, Ethan said. This may take until tomorrow. Stay as long as you need to, Ethan said. Pete will put you up in the bunkhouse. Garrett nodded and went back to his documents. Margaret stood up to refill the coffee and found that her hands were not entirely steady, and she stood at the stove for a moment with her back to both men and breathed. Wife. She told herself it was just a word, a convenience, a social shorthand that didn't mean anything beyond the practical. She told herself this firmly and clearly. Her hands still weren't steady. She poured the coffee. They walked the boundary with Garrett that afternoon, all three of them plus Pete, who kept an expression of careful neutrality throughout. And only once, when Garrett crouched to examine one of Blackwell's steaks and made a low, disgusted sound, allowed himself a brief and expressive glance at Margaret that said everything about what he thought of men who moved survey stakes in the night. Garrett didn't speak much on the walk. He measured, he notated, he photographed locations with a small camera he produced from his satchel. He compared what he found to the original documents with a concentration that reminded Margaret so sharply of her father that she had to look away twice. When they reached the newest stakes, the ones Pete had found Thursday morning, Garrett crouched down and looked at them for a long time. Then he stood up and said to no one in particular, but clearly for the record, "These stakes are fraudulent. I've seen this done before. The original survey was clear. Whoever placed these knew exactly what they were doing, and what they were doing was theft." Pete made a sound. Ethan said nothing. Margaret looked at the stakes, at the solid, unmoved earth around them that had belonged to Ethan's family for 20 years and was now being claimed by a man with a smile and two hired hands and the arrogance of someone who had never been told no by someone who could make it stick. She said quietly, "Can you document it fully, everything?" The original boundary, both sets of fraudulent adjustments, the total acreage affected. "That's my job," Garrett said. He looked at her with what might have been respect. "It'll be in the report by Wednesday morning." "Good," she said. She looked at Ethan. He was looking at the stakes with an expression that was perfectly still and completely controlled, and underneath the control she could see, because she had learned to see it, a cold, contained fury. Not the explosive kind. The kind that doesn't go anywhere until it finds exactly the right moment. She stepped slightly closer to him. Not touching, just closer. He didn't move away. The report came Wednesday as promised, and it was everything they needed. Garrett had documented the original 1871 boundary in full, the first fraudulent adjustment from the previous spring, and the new stakes from Thursday, and his conclusion was unambiguous. Victor Blackwell, or persons acting at his direction, had illegally misrepresented the boundary of the Callahan property on two separate occasions, resulting in the unlawful claiming of 9.4 acres. 9.4 acres. Margaret had known the number, but seeing it in official language in a surveyor's report with Garrett's seal made it different, made it real in a way that could be shown to people. Ethan read the report at the kitchen table on Wednesday morning. He read it twice. Then he set it down. He said, "I need to take this to the county recorder's office, and I need to file a formal complaint with the county sheriff." "Yes," Margaret said, "and you should do both today, before Blackwell hears that Garrett was here." He nodded. He reached for his coat. He stopped. He turned to look at her. "Come with me," he said. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't quite a request. It was more like a statement of what he wanted left open enough for her to accept or decline. She got her coat. What happened at the county recorder's office was not dramatic. It was paperwork and signatures and the particular atmosphere of official buildings that smelled like dust and old wood and the slow machinery of legal process. The clerk received Garrett's report with the efficiency of someone who processed documents every day and was neither moved nor troubled by their contents. But the county sheriff's office was different. Sheriff Dale Mormon had held his position for 11 years, which in Harlow Creek meant he had held it through 2 droughts, a range, war 4 murders, and the ongoing low-grade political pressure of Victor Blackwell, who contributed generously to local elections and expected certain considerations in return. Margaret understood this dynamic the moment they walked in, and the sheriff's expression shifted in the particular way of a man who is working out which version of a problem he is looking at. He was courteous to Ethan. He was politely curious about Margaret. He read Garrett's report with the careful blankness of a man who understood its implications and was buying time to think. Then he said, "This is a civil matter, Ethan. The county recorder is the right place for a boundary dispute. We've been to the recorder, Ethan said. I'm here because someone knowingly placed fraudulent survey stakes on my property. Twice. That's not a civil matter. That's criminal fraud. That would require proving intent, the sheriff said. Thomas Garrett's report documents intent, Margaret said. Both adjustments moved the boundary in the same direction each time, accruing more land to Mr. Blackwell each time after a period of no movement that would have allowed anyone to notice and object. That's not a survey error. That's a pattern. The sheriff looked at her. And you are, he said, leaving the question open in a way that was distinctly unfriendly. Margaret Callahan, she said. And the name came out differently this time than it had on the porch with Blackwell. Not tactical, not defensive, just true. My father was a surveyor. I know what fraudulent adjustment looks like. Your father being a man who reported fraud accurately and was destroyed for it, she said. I'm familiar with what happens when official channels decide a problem is too complicated to pursue. I'm hoping Harlow Creek is different. The silence in the sheriff's office was very loud. Mormon looked from her to Ethan and back. Ethan said quietly, Dale, you know me. You've known me since I was 19 years old. Have I ever come in here with a false complaint? The sheriff was quiet for a moment. No, he said. You haven't. Then take the report, Ethan said, and do your job. Another silence. The sheriff reached across his desk and picked up Garrett's report. I'll look into it, he said. It wasn't a victory. Not yet. But it wasn't a door closed either. They walked out into the cold air of Harlow Creek's Main Street, and Margaret felt the particular exhaustion that comes after sustained tension. The kind where you've been holding yourself very tightly for a long time, and the holding has cost you more than you realized. Ethan stopped on the boardwalk. You all right? He said. Yes, she said. Then more honestly, I will be. He looked at her. You said his name, he said. In there, Callahan. I know. You didn't say it like a strategy this time. She looked up at him. The cold had reddened his jaw, and the afternoon light was flat and gray, and the street was busy with ordinary people going about ordinary Wednesday business around them, and she thought, this is the moment. This is the moment where one of us says the thing that's been building since that platform, since maybe the wrong bride is exactly the right one, since my wife said to a surveyor, as if it were the simplest fact in the world. She said, no, I didn't say it like a strategy. He held her gaze. Margaret. Ethan. She said his name carefully. I need to tell you something. His expression changed, just slightly. The wariness of someone who has heard that sentence before and knows it comes before hard news. Tell me, he said. I've been holding back, she said. Since I got here, I came telling myself it was temporary, that I shouldn't, that I didn't have the right to... She stopped, reorganized. The letters you wrote to Clara. I read them. She showed them to me mockingly the way she showed me most things. And I thought I remember thinking this man is honest. I remember thinking that any woman would be fortunate to have someone write to her that way. She paused. And then I thought I would never be that woman. I was never the woman anyone wrote letters to. Ethan was very still. And then I stepped off a train, she said, and you looked at me the wrong woman, the plain substitute, the charity case, and you didn't look through me the way men always looked through me. You just looked. She pressed her lips together. I don't know what we are. I know what we're not yet. But I'm not holding back from it anymore because I'm afraid you'll realize you settled. Because I think I've stopped believing that's what this is. The street moved around them. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, and his voice was low and very direct, I don't settle. I never have. I would have sent you to the stage in the next town over before I settled. He paused. The night you found the survey records, Margaret, I was looking at a woman who had arrived in my life by accident, and in 2 weeks understood my land better than men I'd known for 20 years. I wasn't thinking about settling. I was thinking about what it would mean if you left. She felt the crack widen, the one in the wall. And, she said, and it meant too much, he said. That's all. It meant too much. And I didn't know how to say it without it sounding like I was making promises I couldn't back up. You always back up your promises, she said. I know, he said. That's why I'm careful about making them. She looked at him. He looked at her. On the boardwalk in Harlow Creek on a gray Wednesday afternoon in front of no one who was paying particular attention, Ethan Callahan took her hand. He didn't make a declaration of it. He didn't announce it. He just reached out and took her hand in his, the way you'd take hold of something you'd decided you weren't willing to let go of, and he held it. Margaret looked down at their hands. She turned her fingers to hold back. They were on the road back to the ranch when Margaret said, "He's going to retaliate." Ethan didn't need to ask who she meant. Yes. The sheriff's visit, the recorder's report, he'll know by tonight. Yes. He's going to do something, she said, something bigger than stakes in the ground. Ethan drove. The horse moved steadily through the cold. He said, I know. Are you ready for that? He looked at her sideways. Are you? He said. She thought about her father, about Boston, about every time she'd made herself small and careful and still lost anyway, about stepping off a train with a worn suitcase and the conviction that she was going to a place where she'd be rejected and instead finding a man who said maybe the wrong bride is exactly the right one and meant it without irony and without condition. She said, yes. He nodded, looked back at the road. Then we're ready, he said. The ranch appeared at the end of the drive, as it always did, solid and weathered and more like home than anything she'd ever approached before. The lights were on in the bunkhouse. Pete was there. Hope was in the barn, weeks old now, and growing faster than seemed reasonable. The land stretched out in every direction, this land that had been fought for and stolen from, incrementally, and was about to be fought for again. They pulled up to the house, and that was when they saw the envelope nailed to the front door. Ethan went up the porch steps in 2 strides and pulled it free. No postmark, no return address. Delivered by hand recently while they were in town. He opened it. He read it. His face did something Margaret had never seen it do before. Not anger, she'd seen anger on him quiet and controlled. Not worry, she'd seen that too. This was something colder, something that had gone past anger into a kind of absolute clarity. He handed her the letter. She read it. It was from Harrison Whitfield's lawyer in Boston. Not a letter about Margaret's supposed breach of obligation. Not a legal threat about returning to honor a verbal agreement. This letter informed Ethan Callahan that he was harboring a woman who was a party to an active fraud investigation in the state of Massachusetts, and that continued association with her would constitute interference in a federal matter and could result in significant legal and financial consequences for himself and his business interests. Margaret read it twice. Her hands were completely steady, because she recognized this move. She'd seen it done to her father. The pivot when pressure didn't work, manufacture a different kind of threat. Don't come after the target. Come after the people around them. Make them into liabilities. Make everyone who cares about them calculate the cost. She looked up from the letter. Ethan was watching her. It's not true, she said. There's no fraud investigation. He's creating one. He has the resources to create the appearance of one, and he's gambling that you don't. I know it's not true, Ethan said immediately. She blinked. You do, Margaret. His voice was patient. I know who you are. I've known who you are since you sat at my kitchen table and told me the whole story instead of the edited version. A woman who defrauds people doesn't do that. He took the letter from her hand. This is Whitfield talking to Victor Blackwell. She stared at him. They know each other, she said. It came out slowly, the realization assembling in real time. I don't know that for a fact, he said. But 2 powerful men deciding at the same time that I'm vulnerable and need to be pressured, that's not a coincidence. He folded the letter. Blackwell has Eastern connections. He made his money in the East before he came out here and started buying land. She thought about the man across the street from the telegraph office, too well dressed for Harlow Creek, watching them with calculated attention. She thought about the timing of Whitfield's first letter arriving the same week Blackwell came to the ranch with his friendly smile and his offer to buy. "They planned this together," she said. "I think they started watching you before you even got on the train," Ethan said. The cold of that settled into her bones. "Clara," she said. "What about her?" "She told me to go to Montana. She laughed about it." Margaret's mind was moving very fast now. What if she was told to? What if Whitfield told Clara to send me here not to get rid of me, but to place me somewhere vulnerable, somewhere they could use against me and against whoever took me in? The silence on the porch was absolute. "That means this was never about me leaving," she said. "It was about where I went when I left." Ethan looked at her. His expression was the one she trusted most, not reassuring, not minimizing, not the face of a man trying to manage a frightened woman. It was the face of a man who was looking at the same problem she was, and taking it exactly as seriously as it deserved. "All right," he said. "Then we stop reacting and we start moving." "What does that mean?" "It means we need two things." He held up one finger. "Garrett's report filed and in the county record before Blackwell can interfere." He held up a second. "And we need to know exactly who Whitfield and Blackwell have in common." He paused. "Ruth Hadley's husband spent 30 years in Boston before he came here. He knew everyone." Margaret thought of Ruth, her sharp eyes the stew with the bay leaf, the way she'd pressed her hand at the door, and said, "Don't let them see you hiding." "You think she knows something?" Margaret said. "I think Ruth Hadley knows everything about everyone, and she's been waiting since the day you arrived for someone to ask her the right question." Margaret reached out and took the letter from his hand. She looked at it once more. Then she looked at Ethan. "Then we go see Ruth," she said. "First thing tomorrow," he agreed. She folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket. And she thought of her father, who had reported what was true and been alone when the retaliation came. She thought of what it cost him to fight clean against people who didn't fight clean without anyone standing beside him. She looked at this man, this quiet, steady, honest man who had just heard that harboring her could cost him everything, who had been set up possibly from the very beginning by people with more money and more reach than either of them, who had every reason to hand her the letter and say, "You need to go," and who instead had said without hesitation, "We stop reacting and we start moving. She understood standing on that porch in the cold with a fraudulent lawsuit and a land theft and a conspiracy. She was only beginning to understand, all pressing in from different directions, that she was not afraid. She was furious. And fury she had learned from her father's example and her own long years of swallowing it, was a great deal more useful than fear. She went inside. There was work to do. Ruth Hadley opened her door at 6:30 in the morning without surprise, which told Margaret everything she needed to know about how much Ruth had been expecting this visit. She stood back from the door and said, "I'll put the kettle on," and didn't ask why they'd come, and didn't ask why Margaret's face had the look of a woman who had been thinking hard since before dawn, and didn't ask why Ethan was carrying a leather satchel that contained, among other things, Thomas Garrett's survey report, and Harrison Whitfield's lawyer's letter, and the original 1871 land deed for the Callahan property. She just put the kettle on. They sat at her kitchen table, a table considerably more crowded with life than Ethan's covered in the accumulated evidence of a woman who cooked seriously and read widely and kept meticulous records of everything. And when Ruth brought the tea, she sat down across from them and folded her hands and said, "Tell me what you need." Ethan said, "Harrison Whitfield." Ruth's expression didn't change, but her hands tightened slightly on her cup. "Boston," she said. "Yes." "What about him?" "We think he and Victor Blackwell know each other," Margaret said. "More than casually. We think they've been coordinating." She laid Whitfield's letter on the table. "This arrived yesterday, nailed to the front door while we were filing Thomas Garrett's survey report with the county recorder." Ruth picked up the letter. "Read it. Set it down." She was quiet for a long moment. "James," she said finally. Her husband, who had died 6 years ago, and whom she still spoke of in the present tense of memory. James worked in Boston for 30 years. Import business. He knew Whitfield. She paused. He did not like him. Why not? Ethan said. Because Whitfield was the kind of man who collected people, Ruth said. He didn't make friends. He made assets. He found people who were useful to him, and he kept them close until they weren't useful anymore. And then he found a way to make sure they couldn't be useful to anyone else either. She looked at Margaret. Like a surveyor who found something he wasn't supposed to find. Margaret felt the breath leave her. He told James about it, she said. It wasn't a question. James knew your father, Ruth said. Not well, professionally. He mentioned him once, said there was a good man in Boston who'd made the mistake of being honest with the wrong client. She paused. He didn't know what happened after. We came to Montana that same year. Ethan leaned forward. And Blackwell? Ruth looked at him steadily. Victor Blackwell came to Montana 8 years ago with a great deal of money and no clear explanation of where it came from. He bought the Henderson property, then the old McCready land, then the mill. He moved fast, which is what men do when they're converting money. They want to put distance between themselves and... She paused. James said he'd heard the Blackwell name in Boston. He couldn't place it exactly, but he said it the way he said Whitfield's name, with a particular kind of quiet. The kitchen was very still. You think Blackwell made his money with Whitfield? Margaret said. I think Blackwell made his money the same way Whitfield made his, Ruth said. By identifying what other people had and finding legal and not so legal ways to take it. She looked at the survey report. Which is exactly what he's been doing to this ranch for 3 years. Ethan sat back. He looked at the table, at the letter, at the survey report, at Ruth. He said quietly, They sent her here on purpose. Ruth looked at him. Think about it, he said. Whitfield knew about the correspondence. He knew Clara Whitmore was writing letters to a ranch in Montana. He finds out Blackwell has been trying to buy out a rancher named Callahan for 3 years with no success. He paused. So he sends Margaret here, not to lose her, to use her. She arrives at my ranch suddenly. I have a scandal on my hands. The town thinks I was made a fool of. I'm weakened and distracted, and Blackwell moves on the boundary at exactly the same time. Margaret had gotten there the night before, but hearing it said out loud in Ethan's voice with Ruth Hadley across the table listening with the stillness of someone who recognized the shape of what she was hearing, it landed differently. And when that didn't work, Margaret said, because you didn't sell, because we pushed back, Whitfield escalated, the lawyer's letter, threatening you directly. Making you a liability, Ethan said. He looked at her. So I'd cut you loose. The word landed between them with its full weight. Margaret held his gaze. And, he said with a quiet certainty that left no room for argument, it didn't work. Ruth looked between them. Something in her expression softened slightly. Just slightly, just enough for Margaret to catch it. And then she picked up her tea and said briskly, So, what are you going to do about it? What you did. What they did about it was this. Ethan went to the sheriff's office and delivered Thomas Garrett's report in duplicate, 1 copy for Mormon, 1 copy for the county courthouse record, filed before 10 o'clock in the morning while Margaret sat in the wagon on the street outside and watched both entrances. And the moment anyone who looked like Blackwell's people moved toward either building, she was prepared to walk in and cause a scene that would make it very difficult to quietly disappear a document. Nobody moved. The filing went through. Then, Ethan sent a telegram to a lawyer in Billings, a name Ruth had given them, a man who had once successfully sued a railroad company over a fraudulent land acquisition and was apparently both brilliant and deeply uninterested in being on the wrong side of history. The telegram was brief and factual, and it asked whether the lawyer was available to take a case involving coordinated fraudulent survey adjustment and interstate intimidation. The reply came back in under 2 hours. Available. Interested. Come Tuesday. Margaret read the telegram twice. She said, he moved fast. Ethan said, Ruth said he hated railroads. I think he hates this kind of thing on principle. Good, Margaret said. We need someone who hates it on principle. They were back at the ranch by noon, and for the first time in days, The pressure in the air felt different, not gone, not by any means gone, but changed in direction. They had stopped absorbing and started moving, and moving felt like breathing after a long time of holding her breath. Pete met them at the barn with a look that meant news. "Blackwell's been at the general store," he said, talking to anyone who'd listen, saying Ethan brought a fraudulent woman into the county and that the whole survey complaint is a smokescreen to distract from her legal problems in Boston. Ethan nodded. "Expected. He's saying the sheriff should be looking at her, not at his survey stakes." "Expected," Ethan said again. Pete looked at Margaret. "You all right?" "I've been called worse things than fraudulent," she said. "Usually by people with more to hide than I do." Pete almost grinned. "Good answer." He took the horses, and they went inside, and Ethan hung up his coat and turned around, and they were standing in the kitchen where they had stood so many times in the past weeks. And something about the ordinary domesticity of it, the familiar table, the familiar smell of coffee and wood smoke, the familiar quality of afternoon light, hit Margaret so unexpectedly that she had to put her hand on the back of a chair. Ethan saw it. He said, "Sit down." "I'm fine, Margaret." He said it gently. "Sit down." She sat down. He put the kettle on the way he'd learned to do it, the way she'd shown him without meaning to teach him anything. The particular order of things that made the coffee come out right, and he stood at the stove with his back to her and said without turning around, "I want to tell you something." She waited. "When you first got here," he said, "when you stepped off that train and told me I'd gotten the wrong bride, I want to tell you what I actually thought." She was very still. He turned around. He leaned against the counter and looked at her directly the way he looked at things he was being honest about. "I thought she's frightened, and she's ashamed of being frightened, and she's doing a better job of holding it together than I would in her position." He paused. "And I thought Clara Whitmore wrote me 6 letters, and not one of them told me anything real. And this woman has been talking to me for 3 minutes, and I already know more about who she is than I learned in 5 months of correspondence." Margaret said nothing. "I didn't choose you because you were available," he said. "I didn't choose you because there was no one else. I asked you to stay, because in 20 years of running this ranch, I have never once had someone walk my fence line and notice what I missed." He stopped. "I have never once had someone sit up all night with my mare and then say they wanted to not, because they were obligated to, but because they meant it. I have never once." He stopped again, started over. "I am not a man who knows how to say these things. I never have been. But I need you to know that I see you, Margaret. Not the woman who came instead of someone else. Not the woman the town thinks is a mistake I made. You, exactly as you are." The kitchen was completely quiet. Margaret looked at him. She had spent 28 years being looked past. Being the lesser version, the plain one, the utility presence in rooms where other women were the point. She had built herself a life on being useful and capable and self-sufficient, because those were the things that couldn't be taken from her, the way beauty or social standing or family wealth had been taken from others she'd watched fall. She had told herself she didn't need to be chosen. She had told herself chosen was for other women. She said, "I don't know how to do this." "Do what?" "Let someone." She stopped. "I've been taking care of myself for a long time. By necessity. I got good at it. And getting good at it means getting very bad at letting anyone else in. Because letting someone in means they can leave, and everyone I've depended on has left or been taken, and Margaret." She looked at him. He had moved from the counter. He was standing closer now, and he reached out and took her hand, the same way he'd taken it on the boardwalk in town. Not dramatic, not declared, just decided. He said, "I'm not going anywhere." She said, "You don't know that." "No," he agreed. "I don't. Nobody does. But I know that I bought this ranch back from nothing when I was 19 years old, because I decided it was worth fighting for. And I know that you walked into my life by accident and became the most worth fighting for thing in it. And I know that I am not a man who abandons what he's decided to fight for." He paused. "So you can keep telling yourself this is temporary, or you can stop. Either way, I'll still be here tomorrow." She looked at their hands. She looked at him. She said very quietly, "I stopped telling myself it was temporary approximately 11 days ago." He absorbed that. Then slowly the corner of his mouth lifted. Not quite a smile. The thing that came before a smile on a man who had been careful with them for a very long time. 11 days, he said. "The night of the survey records," she said. "When you said you'd been carrying it alone, and I said you didn't have to anymore." She paused. "I meant that beyond the legal situation." "I know," he said. "I knew it then." "And you didn't say anything?" "I was waiting," he said. "For what?" "For you to stop holding back," he said simply. She looked at him for a long moment. And then she did something she hadn't done since before her father died. She stopped calculating, stopped holding the edges of herself in, stopped managing the distance. She just looked at this man who had offered her a home when he owed her nothing, and had called her his wife to a surveyor as if it were simply true, and had held her hand on a public street when half the town was watching, and she felt the last of the wall come down. She said, "Ask me to stay, not just for tonight, not just until this is resolved." He looked at her. He said, "Stay." One word, no conditions, no provisions. She held his hand tighter. "All right," she said. The next morning, Victor Blackwell made his biggest mistake. He came to the ranch with 4 men, not 2, and he didn't bother with friendliness this time. He tied his horse at the gate rather than the porch. Keeping himself back, keeping distance, the move of a man who had calculated that he was coming to deliver something unpleasant and wanted room to leave, and he called out from the yard. Ethan went to the door. Margaret was right behind him. "Callahan," Blackwell said. His voice was still controlled, but the pleasantness was gone. "I've been patient with you. I've tried to do this in a civilized manner. But you filed a report with the county that contains slanderous accusations about my land management, and I want it withdrawn." Ethan stood on the porch with his hands in his coat pockets and said nothing. "The report stays," Margaret said. Blackwell looked at her. His eyes were cold. "This doesn't involve you." "Everything on this property involves me," she said, "and the report stays because every word in it is true and documented by a licensed surveyor and filed with the county recorder, which means you'd need a judge to withdraw it. And I think we both know what a judge is going to say when he reads Thomas Garrett's findings." Blackwell's jaw tightened. "You've been given very bad advice," he said, "by a woman who is herself under legal scrutiny in another state and who has inserted herself into a situation she doesn't understand." "I understand it completely," Margaret said. "I understand that you've been taking land from this ranch for 3 years, one adjustment at a time, and I understand that you coordinated that effort with Harrison Whitfield in Boston. And I understand that when we stopped reacting and started documenting, you panicked." She paused. "I also understand that everything I just said is now being heard by Pete Hadley, who is standing at the barn door, and by at least 3 people on the road who have stopped to watch this conversation." Blackwell looked. He looked at Pete. He looked at the road. He looked back at Margaret. Something shifted in his face. Not defeat, not yet. But the particular recalculation of a man who had just realized the scene he'd planned was not the scene he was in. He said to Ethan carefully, "This isn't over." "No," Ethan agreed. "It's not. The lawyer in Billings will be in touch." Blackwell stared at him. "What lawyer in Billings?" he said. The pleasantness was entirely gone now. In its place was the actual man, sharp calculating and for the first time uncertain. "The one we retained yesterday," Margaret said. "He has Thomas Garrett's report, your fraudulent survey documents, the correspondence from Harrison Whitfield's firm, and a strong professional interest in land theft cases in this county." She held Blackwell's gaze without flinching. "He also has, as of this morning, a letter from James Hadley's business records, which his widow was kind enough to provide, documenting the prior professional relationship between yourself and Mr. Whitfield in Boston." The silence was enormous. Pete Hadley at the barn door was listening with his arms folded and an expression of profound satisfaction that he was making no effort to disguise. Blackwell's 4 men shifted behind him. Blackwell said nothing. He turned. He got back on his horse. He rode out without looking back, and his 4 men followed, and the sound of hoofbeats faded, and then it was just the ranch, solid and weathered, and exactly where it had always been, and the people who belonged to it standing in the January cold. Pete called across the yard, "I'll put coffee on." Ethan looked at Margaret. She was still watching the gate where Blackwell had gone, and her jaw was set, and her eyes were bright, and she was breathing slightly faster than normal, and she looked like someone who had just fought something real and hadn't lost. He said, "You named the lawyer before we've actually told him everything." "I know," she said. "That was a bluff. Half a bluff," she said. "Ruth's letter exists. The rest we'll have by Tuesday." She turned to look at him. "Sometimes you just have to act like the ground is already solid before you've finished laying it." He looked at her. "Your father teach you that too," he said. "No," she said. "I learned that one myself." She paused. "From a man who said maybe the wrong bride is exactly the right one, before he had any evidence that it was true." He held her gaze, and this time the smile made it all the way. Slow and real and completely unguarded, the smile of a man who had been careful with them for so long that when one arrived it changed his whole face, and Margaret, who had been watching for it for weeks, felt something in her chest open like a window in spring. "Get inside," he said. "Pete's making coffee." She walked past him up the porch steps, and as she passed him, his hand caught hers briefly just for a moment, and then let go. She went inside. He stood on the porch alone for one moment, looking at the road where Blackwell had gone, and his expression was exactly what it was when he'd bought back his ranch at 19 from nothing, not triumphant, not relieved, just decided. Then he followed her inside. The coffee was on. The house was warm. The land outside was still his, all of it down to the last surveyed inch, and the woman at his kitchen table, who had arrived on a train platform with a worn suitcase and a broken apology, and had turned out to be the most considerable person he'd ever met, was home. That was enough. That was in fact everything. The lawyer from Billings was named Conrad Fitch, and he arrived on Tuesday morning exactly as promised, which told Ethan something important about him before the man had spoken a single word. Punctual people in Ethan's experience were people who understood that time was a form of respect. And a man who respected other people's time usually respected other things as well. The truth, for instance. Evidence. The difference between what was fair and what was convenient. Conrad Fitch shook Ethan's hand at the door, shook Margaret's hand with equal gravity and said, "Show me everything," and sat down at the kitchen table and didn't stand up again for 3 hours. He read Thomas Garrett's survey report word by word. He read both sets of fraudulent adjustment documents. He read Harrison Whitfield's lawyer's letter. He read Ruth Hadley's written account of her late husband's knowledge of the Whitfield-Blackwell professional relationship in Boston, which Ruth had delivered to the ranch that morning herself, sealed in an envelope, with a note that said, "Only use it well." When he finished reading, he set everything down in a neat stack and looked at them both. He said, "This is clean, this is documented, and this is exactly the kind of case I have been waiting 3 years to bring in this county." Margaret said, "What does that mean exactly?" "It means," Conrad Fitch said, "that Victor Blackwell has been operating under the assumption that no one in Harlow Creek had the resources or the knowledge to fight back effectively. That assumption is no longer accurate." He picked up Garrett's report. A licensed surveyor's documented finding of intentional fraud, corroborated by original land records, combined with evidence of coordinated interstate intimidation. That's not a civil boundary dispute. That's criminal fraud, and it's conspiracy to commit it. He paused. And the involvement of Harrison Whitfield in Boston opens a federal dimension that makes this considerably more serious than either of them anticipated. Ethan said, "How long?" "To file days. To get a hearing weeks. To get a resolution." Fitch looked at him steadily. "Months, possibly. I won't lie to you. Men like Blackwell have resources. He'll fight it. but he'll fight it on record in public in front of a judge, and every move he makes will be documented." He paused. "And men who have been stealing quietly for years tend to make mistakes when they're forced into the open." Margaret thought of her father, of a man who had told the truth in the right channels and lost anyway because the wrong people controlled those channels. She said, "The sheriff, Mormon. He's been accommodating to Blackwell for years." Fitch nodded. "I'm aware of Mormon. I'm not filing in Harlow Creek. I'm filing in the district court in Billings. Different judge, different jurisdiction, different outcome." The table was quiet. Then Pete Hadley, who had been sitting in the corner so silently they'd half forgotten he was there, said, "So we're actually doing this?" "We're actually doing this," Margaret said. Pete nodded once slowly with the expression of a man who had watched his employer absorb 3 years of slow-moving injustice and was now watching the current change direction. Ethan looked at Margaret. She looked back at him. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. Fitch filed the case in Billings on Thursday. By Friday, Harlow Creek knew. The way small towns know things, not through any single announcement, but through the particular osmosis of a community, where everyone's business was everyone's business, and news traveled faster than horses. The story assembled itself in public consciousness within 24 hours. Victor Blackwell had been formally accused of fraudulent land acquisition. A Billings lawyer had filed documents in district court. Thomas Garrett's name was on the survey report, and Thomas Garrett was known in 3 counties as a man who didn't put his name on anything he couldn't stand behind. And Margaret Callahan, because that was the name Harlow Creek had started using without anyone making a formal announcement, was apparently the reason any of it had been found. The woman who had stepped off the train 2 months ago as a subject of gossip and quiet contempt had looked at a fence line and seen what 3 years of intimidation had obscured. Edna Ferris came to the ranch on Saturday. She came alone without a dish and without the armor of her ladies' auxiliary authority, which was how Margaret knew this was not a social call in the performative sense. She stood at the door and said, "I owe you an apology," and Margaret, who had expected many things from Edna Ferris, had not expected that. She said, "Come in." They sat at the kitchen table. Ethan had gone to the eastern boundary with Pete to begin formally remarking the correct line now that the legal process had started and the evidence was on record, and Edna folded her hands and said, "I said things about you when you arrived. To a number of people. I said Ethan had been made a fool of. I said you were nobody." She paused. "I was wrong. Not just about the facts. About the judgment I made before I knew a single true thing about you." Margaret looked at her. "What changed your mind?" she said. "Ruth Hadley told me what you did," Edna said. "With the survey records, and I watched you on that boardwalk with Blackwell, and I watched you in the church, and I watched you every time I expected you to crumble, and you didn't." She paused. "And I thought if I had arrived somewhere as a stranger and been spoken about the way I spoke about you, and I had still stayed and worked and fought for that place, I would want someone to say they were sorry." Margaret was quiet for a moment. She said, "I don't need an apology, Edna, but I appreciate that you came." Edna looked at her with sharp, not unkind eyes. "You're more gracious than I was." "I've had practice being the person people underestimate," Margaret said. "It teaches you not to waste energy on the verdict, only on the evidence." Edna sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "The Ladies' Auxiliary meets Thursday. I'd like you to come, not because you need the social acceptance I think we've established. You don't particularly need anything from us, but because the auxiliary does real work for this community, and you are clearly someone who does real work, and those two things should be in the same room." Margaret looked at her. She thought of everything she'd left behind in Boston. Not the hardship, not the loneliness, but the specific loneliness of being somewhere you were tolerated, but never truly included. She thought of what it would mean to build something different here. Not a life she'd stumbled into temporarily, but one she'd chosen, claimed, built with her own hands in the way her father had built his, surveys brick by brick, documented honest hers. Thursday, she said. I'll be there. The weeks that followed were the strangest of Margaret's life, not because they were difficult, though they were in the ongoing way of legal proceedings and winter ranching, and two people learning how to be fully honest with each other, but because they were underneath all of it deeply and unexpectedly good. Fitch sent weekly updates from Billings. Blackwell had retained expensive counsel, the kind that worked on delay and paperwork volume. But Fitch had anticipated this, and the district judge had proven to be a man with both patience and principles, which was the combination that mattered most. The federal dimension opened when Fitch subpoenaed communication records between Blackwell and Whitfield's firm. What came back was more than either of them had expected: correspondence spanning 4 years, detailing not just the Callahan land strategy, but 2 other fraudulent acquisitions in different counties. A pattern of coordinated pressure against landowners who were identified as vulnerable, and then systematically weakened until they sold. Ethan read the documents in the kitchen on a February evening, and when he finished, he set them down very carefully, and he said, "He did this to other people." "Yes," Margaret said. "People who didn't have a Thomas Garrett or a Conrad Fitch." "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment. "People who sold because they thought they had no choice." "That's how it works," she said. "You don't need to force someone out if you can convince them they're already beaten." He looked at her. "That's what he thought he was doing to me," he said. "Yes." "And it would have worked," he said slowly, "if you hadn't looked at the fence line." She held his gaze. "It would have worked," she said, "if you hadn't let me stay." The fire was going. Outside, the February cold was absolute and indifferent and enormous, the kind of Montana winter that didn't negotiate. Inside the kitchen, in the warm and the ordinary and the increasingly daily miracle of 2 people who had found each other by accident and decided to keep each other on purpose, the distance between them had been closing for weeks, in the way that real distances close, not all at once, but in small, unglamorous increments that add up to something permanent. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. She turned her hand over and held his. "I need to ask you something," he said. Her heart moved. "Ask," she said. "We've been calling you Margaret Callahan since you said it on the porch to Blackwell," he said. "And I've been calling you my wife to anyone who needs to know." He paused. "But we've never actually—" He stopped. He was not a man who was comfortable with this kind of sentence. She watched him work through it the way she'd learned to watch him work through things patiently without rescuing him, because he always got there, and he got there better when he wasn't rushed. He said, "I'd like it to be real. Not for the legal case. Not because of Blackwell or Whitfield or what the town thinks. For us." He looked at her directly. "I'm asking you to marry me, Margaret. Actually, with a judge or a preacher, whichever you prefer, whenever you want. I'm not asking because it's convenient. I'm asking because I don't want there to be any version of the future where you're not mine and I'm not yours." The kitchen was very quiet. She thought of a train platform in January, a frightened woman with a worn suitcase, a man who had turned away everyone's easy assumption of what he should feel and looked at her, actually looked, and said something that had changed the entire course of what happened next. "Maybe the wrong bride is exactly the right one." She said yes. He exhaled just slightly, just enough for her to understand that he had not been entirely certain that he was human enough to have been afraid of this answer, that behind all the steadiness and the patience and the absolute reliability, there was a man who had been lonely for a very long time, and had learned to hide it so well that even he sometimes forgot it was there. "Yes," she said again, because once wasn't enough. "Obviously yes, without question yes." The corner of his mouth, the slow arrival of the smile. She leaned across the table and kissed him, and he kissed her back, and it was not a perfect cinematic moment. They were at a kitchen table covered in legal documents in the middle of a Montana winter, with a foal in the barn and a lawsuit in progress, and it was for exactly those reasons the most real thing she had ever done. They were married in March when the ground was beginning to think about softening. The preacher came from Harlow Creek. Ruth Hadley stood beside Margaret. Pete Hadley stood beside Ethan. Edna Ferris sat in the front row of the small gathering in the ranch's front room and dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, which Pete later said was the most surprising thing he'd ever witnessed, and that he planned to mention it at every opportunity for the rest of his natural life. The ceremony was short and honest and completely without pretension, which was exactly right for both of them. When it was done, when the preacher had said the words, and they had said their words back, Ethan held her hand in his and looked at her with that direct, unguarded look that she had learned was his most private one, the one he gave to things he was completely certain about. He said quietly, just for her, "I got the right one." She said, "You didn't know that on the platform." "No," he agreed. "But I knew you were worth finding out." The case was settled in April. Victor Blackwell, faced with the federal dimension of the charges and the documented pattern of coordinated fraud across 3 counties, agreed to a settlement that returned the Callahan land in full. All 9.4 acres paid reparations to 2 other landowners who had been identified in the correspondence, and resulted in the permanent revocation of his right to conduct land transactions in the state of Montana. It was not a public hanging. It was not the dramatic courtroom collapse that stories sometimes promise. It was paperwork and signatures, and Conrad Fitch calling on a Tuesday afternoon to say in his precise, measured voice, "It's done, Mrs. Callahan. The land is yours." Margaret was in the garden when Pete came to find her. She had been turning the beds since February, working the soil back to something useful, planting things that wouldn't be ready until summer. A long game kind of work, the kind that required believing in future seasons. She stood up when Pete told her. She pressed her hand flat against the turned earth for a moment. She thought of her father, of a man who had told the truth and lost, who had reported what was real and been dismantled for it and never recovered. She thought of what it would have meant to him to know that the same clear-eyed honesty applied by his daughter on someone else's land had won. She thought it mattered. She believed it did. She went inside and found Ethan. He was at the kitchen table with the account books where he usually was on Tuesday afternoons, and he looked up when she came in, and he read her face before she said a word. "It's done," she said. He closed the account book. He stood up. He crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her, and she put her face against his chest, and neither of them said anything for a long time, because there was nothing that needed to be said. The thing they had fought for together was done. The ground was solid. The land was his, was theirs, all the way to the correct eastern boundary, every surveyed inch accounted for and documented and defended. Outside, hope was in the pasture, no longer the wobbling newborn of January, but a real horse, now growing into herself, quick and curious, named by a woman who had arrived believing she was a substitute and had turned out to be the thing itself. Margaret lifted her head. She said, "I want to write to my sister, in Ohio. I haven't written to her in almost 2 years." "Write to her," he said. "I want to tell her where I am. What happened?" She paused. "I want to tell her I'm all right, that I'm more than all right." "Write to her today," he said. She looked up at him. "I also want to fix the porch," she said. "The left chair has been leaning since February, and you haven't said a word about it." He looked faintly guilty. "I was going to get to it." "I know you were." She stepped back and straightened her coat. "I'll get to it first." He watched her move to the door. "Margaret," he said. She turned. He looked at her, this woman who had stepped off a train with a worn suitcase and a breaking voice, and the words, "You got the wrong bride," and had then proceeded to find his stolen land name, his full face down. His enemies win his lawsuit, fix what was broken plant. What would grow and become, in the space of one Montana winter, the most essential thing in his world. He said, "Thank you." She looked at him. "For what?" "For staying," he said. "That first night when I told you the boarding house would be closed. You could have found another way. You're resourceful enough. You would have." He paused. "But you stayed. And everything came from that." She held his gaze. "You let me stay," she said. "That's not a small thing. You didn't have to." "No," he agreed. But I looked at you on that platform, and I thought this woman has more courage than she knows. And I wanted to find out if I was right. Were you?" He almost smiled. "Go fix the porch," he said. She laughed, a real one, full and unguarded, the laugh of a woman who had stopped managing how much of herself was visible. And she went out the door and down the steps, and he listened to her footsteps on the boards, and the sound of her finding the tools in the right place, because she'd put them there herself, and the ordinary music of it was the best thing he'd heard in years. They built it from there. Season by season, the ranch grew into something neither of them had imagined alone. The garden that Margaret had started in February produced enough by August that she sold the surplus in town, and by the following year, the Ladies' Auxiliary was buying her preserves for their autumn fundraiser, which Edna Ferris presented as her own idea, and which Margaret allowed her to claim without a flicker of argument. The eastern pasture returned restored, exactly where it had always been, became the most productive grazing land on the property. Hope the foal, born on a cold January night to a mare named Rosie, and witnessed by a woman who had been awake because she said she didn't sleep well, grew into a horse that every rider in the county wanted and that Margaret refused to sell. "She's not for sale," she told the third man, who made an offer with a patience that was entirely resolute. "She's worth good money," Ethan said, not arguing, just noting. "I know what she's worth," Margaret said. "I know what she represents. She's not for sale." He looked at the horse, at his wife. "All right," he said. Ruth Hadley came to dinner on the first Sunday of every month and brought something she'd baked and sat in the kitchen and talked without stopping for approximately 3 hours, and then went home, having said everything she needed to say. Pete Hadley got married in June to the schoolteacher who was allegedly very good with difficult children, which Pete said was the quality that had attracted him most. And the wedding was held at the ranch because Margaret suggested it, and Ethan said yes before she finished the sentence. There were hard seasons. The winter of the second year was brutal even by Montana standards, and they lost 2 calves, and nearly a third, and there were 2 weeks in February where the accounts were tight enough that the worry was real and concrete and not theoretical. They worked through it the way they worked through everything together, without pretending it wasn't hard, without performing optimism. They didn't feel, because they'd both learned a long time ago, that honest difficulty was easier to carry than a decorated version of it. One evening in that hard February, when the cold was at its worst and the accounts were at their tightest, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, and Margaret sat down across from him and didn't say it'll be fine because she didn't know that it would be, and she wasn't going to lie to him. She said, "Tell me what you're most worried about." He lifted his head. He told her. She listened. Then she said, "All right, here's what I think we should do." And she told him specifically, practically, without minimizing or dramatizing, 3 things they could do this week, 2 things that could wait until March, 1 thing that was a long shot but worth trying. He listened. He said, "The third thing, walk me through that." She walked him through it. He thought about it. "That might work," he said. "It might," she said. It worked. Not perfectly. Not without cost. But it worked the way most real solutions work, imperfectly, honestly, through the sustained application of 2 people thinking harder than they would have thought alone. Afterward, on the other side of that winter, Ethan said to her, not dramatically, just in the kitchen, on an ordinary evening, "I don't know what I did before you." She said, "You managed." "Barely," he said. "You bought back a ranch at 19 from nothing," she said. "You would have managed." "Maybe," he said, "but I wouldn't have wanted to, not the way I want to now." She looked at him across the table. She thought of a woman who had stood on a train platform in January, believing she was the wrong one. Believing she was a substitute, a lesser version, a woman that life had set aside for other purposes. She thought of how certain she'd been of that. How deeply it had been written into her, the bone-level certainty that she was not the one anyone was waiting for. She thought of how completely, entirely, without remainder, she had been wrong. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah. Do you remember what you said to me on the platform the first day?" he thought. "I said maybe the wrong bride is exactly the right one." "Yes." She looked at him. Did you believe it? When you said it. He was quiet for a moment. Honest in the way he was always honest, which meant taking the question seriously rather than reaching for the easy answer. I believed you were worth the chance, he said. I believed I didn't want to make a decision based on what I'd been told to expect. He paused. Whether it was exactly right I didn't know yet. I just knew I wasn't willing to say no before I found out. She nodded. And now, she said. He looked at her. The direct look. The certain one. Now I know, he said. She smiled. Outside, hope moved in the pasture. The land ran to its correct boundary, every surveyed inch documented and defended. The house that had smelled of wood smoke and old coffee, and the particular loneliness of a man running out of reasons to come inside, now smelled of something else entirely. Meals and work, and the daily accumulation of two lives conducted in full, without holding back, without managing the distance. Years later, after the garden expanded, after Pete's children started calling Margaret Aunt Maggie, with the casual confidence of children who have never known anything different, after Hope had foals of her own, and the ranch was known 3 counties over. Not for any dramatic reason, but simply for the sustained quality of everything it produced. Someone at the Ladies' Auxiliary asked Margaret how she'd ended up in Harlow Creek. She said, I got on the wrong train. The woman laughed. And it worked out. Margaret thought of Ethan, of everything that had been built in the years since a January platform and a worn suitcase and 2 words that had changed everything. She thought of her father, who had been honest with the wrong people and paid for it, and of herself, who had been honest with the right one and found that honesty given to the right person was not a liability. It was the thing that built everything else. She said it worked out exactly right. She meant it without qualification, without the held-back edges she'd once used to protect herself from hoping too much, without the careful distance she'd maintained for 28 years between herself and the possibility that she was in fact someone worth choosing. She meant it the way you mean things when you've stopped being afraid of them. The wrong bride, the right life. The love that neither of them had gone looking for, that had arrived by accident on a winter morning, and turned out to be the most deliberate, decided, hard-won thing either of them had ever built. That was how it started. With a mistake, and 2 people brave enough to look at the mistake and say, this is not an ending. This is where we begin. And they were right.